Thank you so much for that, and also for laying out so clearly why it's so crucial to see climate change in connection with other crises that face as a result of capitalism, such as imperialism, austerity, and the border regime. I'm going to start by speaking a little bit about capitalism itself. The capitalist mode of production is dependent on continuously escalating the extraction of natural resources, which necessitates a non-stop rise of greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and environmental degradation. Without ending capitalism, we have no chance of combating climate breakdown. To take just one example, in our current economic order, major petroleum companies are able to manipulate and to a large extent control state policies and act as stakeholders in international agreements, avoiding liability for damage done to people living near pipelines and other oil facilities. Big petroleum companies have whole departments dedicated to lobbying states, and states in capitalism are locked into the pursuit of profit and maximising their own national economic growth. I'm going to quote my comrade Brian Parkin, who's put it this way: it's both an irony and a paradox that have developed the scientific means of understanding both the causes and possible means of reducing climate change, whilst being locked into a mode of production for which the appetite for petroleum remains insatiable. Meanwhile, the numbers of people displaced across the world continues to grow. The UN is predicting 200 million climate refugees by 2050, or as they call it, persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. However, when we talk about climate refugees, we need to think not just about people who have to relocate due to floods, droughts, or extreme climate phenomena, but also about people needing to move due to conflict over resources, food insecurity, imperialist war, and economic migration in the wake of whole areas of the world becoming rapidly made uninhabitable. I think it's becoming increasingly evident that more and more people will be forced to flee, and that meanwhile there's basically a pact existing between our governments and international capital that ensures a license to exploit both labour power and natural resources in increasingly extreme ways. In this context, the role of the state as a container of the crisis starts becoming clear. So while the pressure is building and breakdown is looming across the world, Western states, including Britain, are fortifying their borders, and border controls are creeping ever deeper into all parts of our societies. Borders perform a crucial function, ensuring that the crisis appears contained through the control of citizenship and the control of the movement of people. This division, so the borders represent an attempt to maintain the global division of labour through creating areas of the world where social reproduction, that is the wages and maintenance cost of the labour force, are significantly cheaper. This division of labour structures the world in such a way that entire sections of the economy are particularly specialised, for example, in extractive industries such as oil drilling. They're also dependent on certain markets which make up the other side of the division of labour. So to take one quite clear example, highly intensive mineral mining in Africa depends on and supports global supply chains with phones made in China and then sold in Europe. This means that entire areas of the world have become less and less able to provide for the varied needs of the populations who actually live there. And borders reinforce this division by regulating the flow of commodities between these different poles and tying people to particular areas of the world. We see that extractive industries often provide the majority.
Can you talk a bit slower, please?
I will do my best. Yes. Borders reinforce this division by regulating the flow of commodities between these different poles and tying people to particular areas of the world. We also see that extractive industries provide the majority of the funding for the same militias that police borders and control the supplies of resources. So, for example, in Sudan, you have the Janjaweed militia, which gets their revenue from Sudanese oil fields, but they also get revenue from the European Union, which pays them to enforce the borders and stop desperate people trying to reach crossing points into Europe. This correspondence of extractive industry, borders, and the repressive state regime points to the fact that we've been seeing climate refugees in the broad sense for decades in the form of people fleeing the wars in the Middle East waged over the world's petroleum hubs, or in the form of so-called economic migrants that are moving away from areas of the world that are made uninhabitable or unable to support its population by extracting capital. So in Britain, the border also creates and reinforces the division of labour. The border regime determines which people have the right to work or to claim benefits, or even to reside in the country. In reality, under capitalism, no one can live without income or without a wage. So many migrants are forced to accept illegal contracts, paying less than minimum wage, or are threatened into not demanding better paying conditions by the threat of criminalisation or deportation. And despite that, even sections of the left are failing to show the basic political solidarity needed against the border and against these racist divisions. The border is in many ways a micro-version of the global division of labour in capitalism, which is destroying the planet, and even mirrors many other practices of colonial control, which was tested on colonised peoples, such as surveillance methods, violent repression, detention without trial, and so on. solidification of the border regimes in the UK, Europe, and the US cannot be analysed without recognising that the borders imposed on the world through globalism and imperialism are both unstable and arbitrary, and that the global ravages of capitalism is creating conditions from which people will, of course, need to move. Fighting the states on the territory of our borders, or calling for an end to borders per se, has long been seen as an extremely radical demand, maybe more polemical than real, but with the climate breakdown, this is no longer so. Often, however, conversations about climate change centre not on the ravages of capital, but instead on the supposed ravages of people. I'm going to talk about two different related examples of this. The first is overpopulation, which is a boogeyman for a global crisis, which is shared across the political spectrum, from mass murderers to David Attenborough. This idea that it's people who are exhausting the world's resources, and that these resources can never grow at the same rate as the human population, is not a new argument. Thomas Malthus called population control for poor people, so overpopulation, he claimed, led to a host of societal ills. These same arguments are used today, primarily against populations in the global south. So the argument goes, climate change is caused by too many people, and particularly the too many people who live outside the West. This is an old argument, and which has been addressed by Marx as well, particularly as related to Ireland. So I'm going to quote, he wrote, as appetite grows with eating, English capitalists will continue to discover that Ireland, with 3.5 million people, still continues to be miserable because we're so overpopulated. Therefore, Ireland's depopulation must go further in order that she may fulfill her true destiny to be a sheep-walk and cattle pasture for English capitalists. Point being that Ireland is not overpopulated, and neither is the global south overpopulated today. Capital is, however, over-extracting and overproducing. In the same way that English capitalists restructured the Irish economy to gear it towards the wool trade, large parts of the world are made uninhabitable through organising local economies for the production of commodities for export rather than for the reproduction of the population. So put more specifically, areas of the world are only overpopulated insofar as their global ecosystems become organised to produce certain commodities for international markets. And these global markets are what causes people, the so-called overpopulation, to have to move. When capital is moving, there's huge demand for labour. When it's bust, those populations are no longer required. This explains in part the change in attitudes towards migration over the last 50 years. When the post-war period, European markets demanded more labourers and were happy to bring them in from the colonies at worse pay and in poorer conditions than the native population, of course. Now, in the context of climate breakdown and imperialist warfare, the situation is different. In the same way that Malthusians argue that people are draining natural resources, people in the West are describing those who migrate here as draining the resources of our nation states or our national economies. The broader point I'm making here is that we can't talk in abstract terms about overpopulation. Economic conditions are always underpinning state responses to migration. Even on the kind of left environmentalist side, people use these arguments. For example, Rupert Reed, who recently did an Question of Time, and a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, has written about how mass migration reduces social cohesion, which in his view means that it will be impossible to create a kind of collaborative, progressive economy that would need to become greener. He's also argued that moving people from areas with low environmental footprints to high impact areas in the West is a bad thing. That's just thinly veiled racism, and it's believed that some people belong in poorer and more exploited parts of the world. It's also part of what fuels a growing number of so-called eco-fascists who have an essentialist and racist view of environmentalism as being about retreating back to our natural homelands where we're living separated by race. I'm going to start finishing up now, and I just want to conclude by saying the following. So I think it's really obvious that a lot of people on the left have been unacceptably slow in accepting that responding to climate change needs to be a really key part of our international solidarity. But there are some positive examples that I just want to highlight. So earlier this week, environmental group Bristol Rising Tide occupied part of the Home Office's depot in Portishead with reclaiming power and stopped immigration enforcement bans from leaving. The Stars 15 action, where activists blocked a deportation flight, was in large part organised by people who had learned techniques for protesting at airports from the climate movement. And during the school strike in September, migrant solidarity groups, including Lesbians Against Proper Migrants, organised a block using the slogan, "Climate justice is migrant justice." So while for now we're not feeling the sharpest edge of climate change in this country, and are in some ways separated from those who are, if we consider ourselves to be anti-capitalist, we have to recognise that climate change, as with capitalism itself, binds together each place, each person, and each contradiction. The worldwide ecological breakdown and the ravages of imperialism, transnational capital, and increasingly militarised border regimes across the world cannot be addressed by disorganised legalistic proposals. So the Paris Accord, the Supreme Court, or even the Labour Party are not going to save us from climate breakdown, and they will certainly not save those forced to migrate from imperialist wars, breakdown of ecological systems, or deepening poverty. It should come as a surprise for socialists, communists, anti-capitalists that the world is facing a breaking point. We have always known that capitalism leads to constant crisis, misery and war. For so many people across the world, the catastrophe is already here and it's been going on for much longer than climate change has been on the agenda in the Western world. Climate change is simply demonstrating that it's completely untenable to continue to look at the world this way.